Senator Tommy Tuberville's voice cut through the chamber with the sharpness of a whistle on a football field. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded with the swagger of a man certain of victory. Then, with the kind of grin that suggested the cameras were his true audience, he leaned forward and asked the one question he thought would corner her. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you even understand the military?" The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Conversations stilled. Papers froze mid-shuffle. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed to pause, as if the entire room waited for her reaction. Tuberville's allies smirked, whispering like fans before kickoff. He believed he had landed the line that would stick, the dagger that would expose her as unprepared, unworthy, out of her depth. But across the chamber, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Her eyes locked on him with a steadiness that made even the seasoned senators shift in their seats. She didn't blink, didn't rush, didn't let the trap tighten. Instead, her silence became its own form of power. The arrogance of the question only magnified against her composure. The cameras caught it, the widening eyes of spectators, the subtle gasps from the gallery, the almost imperceptible tightening of Tuberville's jaw as seconds stretched into suspense. To the audience at home, it wasn't just politics unfolding, it was theater, high drama, a battle of dignity versus ego playing out in real time. Somewhere in that chamber, a veteran shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the insult buried in Tuberville's words. Others exchanged glances as though realizing the senator had gone one step too far. He had invoked the military not as a point of honor, but as a weapon of condescension. Still, Crockett held her ground. She leaned in just slightly, her presence growing larger without a single word spoken. For a moment, the chamber felt like a court of history itself, judging which version of America would speak louder, the arrogance of dismissal or the quiet force of lived truth. And then, just as Tuberville's confidence reached its peak, just as his supporters prepared to laugh off the silence, Crockett opened her mouth. But Crockett's answer wouldn't just silence him, it would ripple across the nation. For months, Tommy Tuberville had fashioned himself as the self-appointed watchdog of the military establishment. His name had become synonymous with obstruction, placing holds on promotions, turning honorable service into a bargaining chip, and dressing up partisan maneuvering as principled stands. To some, he was a coach who never stopped playing the game, trading playbooks for politics, but keeping the same swagger. To others, he was something more dangerous, a man so convinced of his own righteousness that he would gamble with the careers of those who had dedicated their lives to defending the country, and it wasn't just the procedural delays. Tuberville's words had grown infamous. He questioned the readiness of the armed forces. He mocked the values of diversity that had long strengthened America's ranks. He dismissed the lived experiences of military families with the kind of casual arrogance that left veterans shaking their heads. At rallies, he played to applause lines. On the Senate floor, he leaned on sound bites designed for headlines. Over and over, the same picture emerged, a man willing to question sacrifice he had never himself endured. But here's the thing about military service. It isn't abstract. It isn't a chessboard of strategies or a rhetorical tool to be tossed about in debate. It is blood, sweat, and sacrifice. It is the young recruit who leaves home for the first time, unsure if they'll ever return. It is the parent who watches their child march off in uniform, pride warring with fear. It is the folded flag on a widow's mantle, the empty seat at Thanksgiving, the silent toll that families carry long after speeches end and cameras shut off. For Americans across the spectrum, service is sacred. It belongs not to politicians but to the people who give everything when the nation calls. Tuberville had gambled that dismissing Crockett's understanding of the military would play like all his other stunts. Loud enough to spark outrage, bold enough to look tough, shallow enough to dodge real scrutiny. What he underestimated was that Crockett's knowledge wasn't theoretical, nor was her connection distant. She wasn't quoting statistics from a briefing memo or repeating talking points crafted by aides. Her understanding was woven into her family's story, stitched into her very sense of identity. The silence that followed his question wasn't hesitation. It was the pause of someone choosing precisely how much of their truth to reveal. Because when Crockett finally spoke, she would not just defend her knowledge. She would reveal a bond with service that Tuberville could never touch. In that chamber, tension thickened. Observers sensed something deeper at play. They leaned forward, curious, waiting. Tuberville thought he had placed her in a corner, but in reality, he had opened the door to the one answer that could unravel his posture completely. The very subject he believed to be his weapon, the military, was about to become his undoing. He had no idea the very ground beneath his argument was about to collapse. Before he ever set foot in the Senate chamber, Tommy Tuberville had lived a life defined by stadium lights, roaring crowds, and the calculated swagger of a football coach who thrived on spectacle. On the field, bluster worked. Barking orders, drawing up plays, commanding young athletes, his authority was rarely challenged. Wins and losses became his resume, and personality became his brand. When he left coaching for politics, he carried that same energy with him, the strut of a man who believed volume could substitute for vision. But politics is not a football game, and leading a nation requires more than locker room bravado. Tuberville, however, seemed to approach the Senate floor as though it were just another arena. He wore his outsider status like a badge, brushing off criticism as if every rebuke were just the jeering of rival fans. It made for good headlines, but it also made for disastrous policy. His most notorious move came when he single-handedly blocked hundreds of military promotions, holding the careers of decorated officers hostage to score political points. He justified it as principle, but even seasoned members of his own party winced at the recklessness. For months, officers who had given decades of service to the United States sat in limbo, their families left waiting, their futures stalled. Veterans groups sounded alarms, generals warned of readiness risks, and military families begged for relief. Yet Tuberville dug in, unmoved, repeating the same rehearsed lines with the stubbornness of a coach refusing to change a losing playbook. And it wasn't just the blockade. His gaffes piled up like fumbles in a game he didn't understand. He confused basic policy details in interviews. He misstated military facts that any freshman staffer could have briefed him on. He tossed around phrases that revealed not only a lack of depth, but a lack of respect. To Tuberville, every conversation seemed like an audition for a soundbite, rather than an opportunity for governance. Still, he carried himself with the smug confidence of someone who believed charm could erase ignorance. His allies praised his folksy style, his plain-spoken manner, his willingness to say it like it is. His critics, however, saw through it a man who cloaked arrogance in simplicity, who performed authenticity while dismissing the very real consequences of his choices. And so, when he turned his attention to Jasmine Crockett, he walked into the confrontation with the same playbook he had always used. He believed she was an easy target, young, outspoken, untested in his eyes. He thought questioning her grasp of military affairs would earn chuckles from colleagues and a nod of approval from pundits eager for conflict. He thought his performance would dominate the headlines, his question echoing louder than any answer she could muster. It was classic Tuberville. Underestimate the opponent, overestimate himself. The room felt his confidence when he leaned forward, that rehearsed smirk on his face, his tone dripping with condescension. This was the senator at his most performative, convinced he had drawn blood before the fight had even begun. What Tuberville failed to recognize was that politics is not a sideline, and public service is not a game. The people in that chamber were not players waiting for a whistle, and Jasmine Crockett was not the easy mark he believed her to be. He had entered with the arrogance of a man who thought he already knew the ending. What he didn't expect was Crockett's calm firepower, forged not in politics, but in family sacrifice. Long before Jasmine Crockett walked the halls of Congress, she walked the narrow streets of her Texas hometown, raised in a household where dignity was not just taught, but lived. Her family was no stranger to sacrifice. They were no strangers to watching loved ones put on uniforms, say their goodbyes, and head into uncertainty with nothing but faith in the flag stitched onto their sleeves. For Crockett, service wasn't an abstract principle. It was the soundtrack of her childhood, the story that echoed around the dinner table, the reality that shaped her values. Her parents raised her on the twin pillars of education and service. Books were treasures, but so too were the stories of cousins, uncles, and grandparents who had stood in formation, taken oaths, and carried the weight of duty across oceans. Crockett grew up listening to accounts of hardship and resilience, deployments that stretched across birthdays, homecomings marked by tears, and the quiet pride that never needed to be shouted. In her family, patriotism wasn't about slogans or campaign ads. It was about sacrifice measured in days spent apart, scars borne on bodies, and names carried in prayers. From a young age, Jasmine understood what many politicians only pretended to grasp. The military is not a prop. It is not a tool for grandstanding. It is flesh and blood, families and futures. She saw her relatives return with medals, yes, but also with the invisible weight of what they'd endured. She saw her community rally around those who had lost sons and daughters. These experiences did not harden her. They grounded her. They gave her a respect for service so deep it became part of her character. That grounding made her resilient. In school, when classmates doubted her ambition, she turned their skepticism into fuel. When doors closed, she found new ones to open. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she was built from tougher material than arrogance could ever dismiss. And as she moved into law and then politics, that resilience never wavered. She wasn't in it for performance or applause or the soundbite of the day. She was in it because service was in her bloodline, and justice was her chosen battlefield. Her authenticity became her signature. She never pretended to be polished in ways that weren't her. She spoke directly, sometimes with sharpness, sometimes with humor, always with honesty. Voters recognized it. Colleagues noticed it. Even critics, though they rolled their eyes, understood it. Crockett's power wasn't in playing a role, it was in refusing to play at all. She was who she was, and that made her unshakable. When she arrived in Congress, she carried with her the weight of representation, not just as a black woman from Texas, but as a voice for families like hers, families who had given their sons and daughters to the military, families who understood what patriotism looked like not in speeches but in empty chairs at the dinner table, families who knew that service isn't just the act of enlisting, it's the act of holding together everything that service leaves behind. That authenticity, that grounding in service and sacrifice, is what made Tuberville's arrogance so misguided. He thought he was confronting a politician grasping at talking points. Instead, he was facing a woman whose very identity was woven with the threads of military service. Her knowledge wasn't secondhand, it was lived. Her patriotism wasn't performative, it was proven in the stories of her own bloodline. The chamber didn't know this backstory in full, but they felt it in the way she carried herself. They felt it in her refusal to shrink under his question, in the steadiness of her eyes, in the silence that stretched until it became power. Crockett had been underestimated before. It was almost routine, but every time she drew from the same well, a life built on resilience, a family bound by sacrifice and values too deeply ingrained to ever be shaken by arrogance. And so, when Tuberville tried to question her patriotism, she wasn't just answering for herself, she was answering for her bloodline. The chamber had already gone still from Tuberville's first question, but he wasn't finished. He leaned forward again, sensing an opportunity to press harder. His voice rose, each word laced with condescension. It's one thing to read about defense policy in a binder, Congresswoman, but do you actually understand the military? Do you have any experience, any real connection that makes you qualified to speak on this? A ripple of unease moved through the room. Some senators shifted in their seats, others exchanged side glances. The staffers in the background froze, pens halfway to paper, as though not wanting to miss what came next. Even the journalists perched in the gallery leaned in, suddenly alert. They knew the cadence of a viral moment when they heard it, and Tuberville was setting the stage for one. But Jasmine Crockett did not take the bait. She didn't meet his rising volume with volume of her own. Instead, she remained still, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture unshaken. Her silence was not retreat, it was control. She let his words hang in the air, let the arrogance echo, let the discomfort spread across the room until even his allies began to look uneasy. Tuberville, misreading her composure, doubled down. Because frankly, when it comes to America's readiness, we don't need lectures from people who've never worn the uniform, who don't know what real service demands. He said it like a challenge, like a line rehearsed for applause. Yet the chamber offered no applause, no nods of agreement, only tension that grew heavier by the second. Crockett finally lifted her eyes from the table, fixing them squarely on him. The shift was small, but it carried weight. The room felt it. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, the kind that made the air itself seem to tighten. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble into a defensive rebuttal. She simply breathed, measured, deliberate, choosing the timing with the precision of someone who understood that silence, when wielded correctly, can be louder than any speech. A cough echoed from the back row. A reporter scribbled furiously in a notebook. Another raised a camera, focusing tightly, sensing something historic about to unfold. Even Tuberville, confident just moments earlier, adjusted in his chair as if suddenly aware that the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he believed. The seconds ticked by, each one lengthening the suspense. To the outside world, it would later look like a perfectly orchestrated pause, the kind of moment every political strategist dreams of, where the entire nation holds its breath at once. But to Crockett, it was instinct. It was the natural response of someone who had been underestimated too many times to count, who had learned that sometimes the best answer is to let arrogance expose itself before delivering the blow. When she finally opened her mouth to speak, her voice was calm, low, and certain. The contrast to Tuberville's bluster was stark, so stark that even those in the chamber who had been rooting for him now leaned closer, unable to resist the gravity of her composure. The tension was unbearable, the kind of suspense that demanded release. Then she delivered the words that flipped the room upside down. The chamber had been tense before, but now the silence was weaponized. Tommy Tuberville leaned forward, his tone smug, as if he were the veteran gatekeeper of patriotism. He had thrown his challenge squarely at Rep's Jasmine Crockett, demanding she explain what she knew about the military. Its culture, its costs, its sacrifices. For a moment, she let the weight of his words hang in the air. She didn't flinch, didn't rush. Instead, she looked directly at him, eyes steady, and then slowly scanned the room, making sure everyone, journalists, staffers, fellow lawmakers, was watching. This was not going to be a rebuttal. It was going to be a reckoning, the pivot Crockett began softly. Senator Tuberville, you've spent months questioning the readiness of our military, she said, her voice calm but sharp enough to slice the silence. You've cast doubt on the very people who put on the uniform. And now you're questioning me? Her words were not rushed. They were layered, deliberate. Each sentence built upon the last like a trial attorney cross-examining a hostile witness. Let me tell you what I know about the military. I know it's not a talking point. I know it's not a prop for grandstanding. I know it's not a bargaining chip to score headlines. Across the chamber, aides began scribbling faster. Phones tilted up, recording. Journalists leaned forward, sensing something rare. A politician about to lift the veil on something personal. The reveal, then came the pivot. My family has worn the uniform of this country for generations, she continued, her cadence intensifying. My grandfather fought for a nation that did not yet give him full rights as a black man, but he still believed in America enough to risk his life for it. My uncles and cousins served in conflicts overseas, coming home with wounds seen and unseen. And today, members of my family continue that legacy in uniform. The room shifted. What began as a tense exchange had now transformed into a deeply personal testimony. Crockett wasn't just defending herself. She was summoning ghosts. History, sacrifice, and legacy all at once. The knife twist, her voice hardened, the volume rising just enough to echo across the chamber. So when you stand here and try to test me on military values, Senator, understand this. You're not testing me. You're testing my family. You're testing generations of service that you have no right to diminish. Gasps fluttered from the gallery. Staffers exchanged glances. Tuberville blinked, his composure cracking for the first time all afternoon. His trademark smirk faded just slightly, a microsecond of recognition that this was a fight he could not win. The emotional crescendo Crockett leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow commanded even greater attention. My grandfather used to say, "We fight not because this country is perfect, but because we believe it can be. That's what service means. That's what sacrifice means. And that is what you, Senator, seem to have forgotten." For a full 2 seconds, the chamber went still. No coughs, no shuffling of papers, not even the nervous tapping of shoes against marble floors. Just silence, thick, reverent silence. Then came the murmurs. Then the rustle of chairs. Then the unmistakable sound of journalists' thumbs racing across screens. Viral firestorm within minutes, the outside world had caught wind. On Twitter, clips of Crockett's counterattack exploded. She ended him. Crockett just destroyed Tuberville with facts and family honor. This is how you defend the military. With lived truth, not cheap talk. Tuberville underestimated her. Big mistake. On TikTok, the clip was already being remixed with dramatic music, captions flashing across the screen. My grandfather fought for a country that didn't yet fight for him, set against slow zooms and looping applause tracks. Meme accounts pounced. Split-screen edits showed Tuberville's face collapsing in real time, side by side with Crockett's calm firepower. Hashtag surged, schmick drop moment, Crockett vs. Tuberville, Jas family service. What had been an inside-the-beltway spat suddenly became a viral parable about honor, arrogance, and authenticity. Tuberville rattled back in the chamber. Tuberville shuffled his papers, his eyes darting as if looking for an escape hatch. His trademark strategy, deflect, dismiss, dominate, had short-circuited. He had walked into the room assuming he was holding the higher ground on patriotism. But in less than 5 minutes, Crockett had pulled the ground out from under him, leaving him suspended, exposed, and visibly rattled. The crowd could feel it. The cameras captured it. And Tuberville himself, shifting in his seat, seemed to know it. Crockett's final blow, Crockett didn't let the silence linger long enough for Tuberville to recover. She pressed forward with one last strike. Senator, the men and women who serve this country deserve better than to be pawns in your political games. They deserve leaders who respect sacrifice, whether it comes from a soldier in uniform or the families who carry their stories. I carry those stories, and I will never let them be cheapened by anyone, not even you. She let the words hang. Then she leaned back, folded her hands, and waited. There it was, the mic drop. No shouting, no theatrics, no insult. Just pure, lived conviction delivered with surgical precision, the chamber reaction. The pause afterward was deafening. Some in the gallery broke into quiet applause before being hushed by security. Others shook their heads in disbelief, whispering to colleagues, "Did you just hear that?" Even seasoned journalists hardened to political theater admitted later they felt the hairs rise on the back of their necks. This was no routine exchange. It was the kind of unscripted, authentic moment that cuts through the noise of American politics and sears itself into memory. Cliffhanger, and as the silence stretched on, the weight of Crockett's words still echoing through marble walls, one thing became clear. This wasn't over, because the silence in that chamber was only the beginning. The shockwaves were just starting. When Jasmine Crockett leaned back in her chair after delivering her mic-drop counterattack, the moment did not stay confined within the marble walls of the chamber. It burst outward like a seismic tremor, rippling across phones, screens, airwaves, and conversations all over the country. What began as a tense exchange between two lawmakers was now a cultural event. Twitter X erupts. The first shockwave hit Twitter, or X as Elon Musk still insisted it be called. Clips of Crockett's words spread faster than even seasoned operatives could keep up with. Within an hour, hashtags like Truck Family Service and Sasa Crockett Silences Tuberville trended nationwide. "She lit him up," read one viral post paired with a looping gif of Tuberville's expression cracking in real time. Another post racked up hundreds of thousands of likes. "Her grandfather fought for a country that didn't fight for him." That line will echo for decades. Political insiders posted frantic threads analyzing every pause, every glare, every rhetorical beat. But the public didn't need analysis, they felt it. The dignity, the composure, the authenticity of Crockett's rebuttal cut through the noise like few political moments ever do. TikTok and meme culture. On TikTok, the clip took on a life of its own. Creators added cinematic soundtracks, Hans Zimmer crescendos, trap beats, even gospel choirs. Each remix only amplified the drama. A viral edit overlaid Crockett's words with black and white slow motion, captions flashing, "We fight not because this country is perfect." Before cutting to Tuberville's hollow stare, meme accounts had a field day. One side-by-side showed Crockett's calm posture contrasted with Tuberville squirming, captioned, "Confidence versus arrogance." Another framed the moment as a video game boss battle. Crockett, glowing with +100 family honor, facing Tuberville, who suddenly lost all his pleasant 10 patriotism points. By nightfall, Gen Z and millennials were quoting Crockett's lines in the same way they once quoted movies. It wasn't just political, it was pop culture. Late-night spotlight. The late-night shows wasted no time. On The Daily Show, the clip played unedited, the studio audience gasping in sync with the chamber. The host quipped afterward, "Senator Tuberville wanted to test her military knowledge. Turns out she had the receipts in her DNA." The punchline landed, but the weight of Crockett's words lingered even through the laughter. On The Tonight Show, A sketch imagined Tuberville Googling how to look patriotic in panic as Crockett delivered her speech. The joke wasn't just about Tuberville's stumble. It was about Crockett's unshakable presence. She had shifted the tone of the debate, and late-night hosts recognized the cultural gravity. Veterans' response, but perhaps the most powerful shockwave came from veterans themselves. Organizations representing service members and military families released statements praising Crockett's defense of sacrifice. One group wrote, Reppers Crockett reminded America that service is not a talking point. It's a legacy written in blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Her words honored not just her family, but every family who has given to this country. Individual veterans flooded social media with their own testimonies. A retired Marine tweeted, "I don't care what party you're in. That woman spoke the truth about why we serve. Respect." Another posted a photo of his late father in uniform, captioning it, "This is who she was speaking for." The resonance was undeniable. Crockett had tapped into a vein of authenticity that transcended politics. Tuberville's camp in retreat. Meanwhile, Tuberville's team scrambled. Press aides tried to downplay the moment, claiming he was simply asking basic questions about military readiness. But the spin fell flat. Every attempt to reframe the exchange was drowned out by the raw footage circulating endlessly. Conservative outlets split on the defense. Some tried to rally around Tuberville, painting Crockett's remarks as too emotional. Others quietly sidestepped the moment altogether, unwilling to amplify a narrative that made their senator look small, and therein lay Tuberville's dilemma. Every time his camp tried to explain, the clip replayed again. Every defense only refreshed the wound, keeping the moment alive in public consciousness, the relentless circulation. By the end of the week, Crockett's words had been viewed tens of millions of times. Students were quoting her in classrooms. Commentators were debating whether it was the most powerful congressional clapback of the year. Even apolitical Americans, those who usually tuned out Washington, found themselves watching the clip, sharing it, and nodding along. It wasn't just about Crockett versus Tuberville anymore. It was about what her words symbolized, cliffhanger. The chamber silence that day had been profound. But the silence afterward, the kind where millions of Americans stopped, reflected, and reconsidered what service and sacrifice truly meant, was deeper. And as the memes, hashtags, and headlines swirled, one truth became inescapable. This moment was bigger than a clash between two lawmakers, because beyond the viral noise, this moment tapped into something deeper, America's own conscience. In the days that followed, pundits tried to dissect what had happened. They counted the retweets, tracked the headlines, replayed the footage again and again. But what lingered most was not the numbers, it was the feeling. Because Jasmine Crockett had done more than win a political spat. She had reframed what patriotism means, and in doing so, reminded the country of something it had been in danger of forgetting. Tuberville's question had been born from arrogance. His tone carried the assumption that patriotism was about dominance, about flexing one's chest in a show of superiority. To him, military knowledge was a measuring stick, something to corner, to belittle, to weaponize against a colleague. But Crockett showed that service is not a talking point. It is not a trophy to wave, nor a credential to gatekeep. It is sacrifice, quiet, unglamorous, generational sacrifice. Her words placed dignity against arrogance, and the contrast was blinding. Where Tuberville tried to score points, she spoke of her family's service without theatrics, without vanity. Where he sought to diminish, she elevated. In a single exchange, she revealed that true patriotism doesn't sneer, doesn't mock, doesn't question others' worth. True patriotism is lived. The resonance of that truth was universal. Parents saw their own sons and daughters in her story. Veterans saw their own scars mirrored in her words. Immigrants saw the affirmation that sacrifice and loyalty are not measured by birthplace or party line, but by action and devotion. Crockett had reached into the marrow of American identity and pulled forth its most enduring principle, that respect is owed to those who serve, not to those who grandstand, and so the moment became something more than viral spectacle. It became a moral lesson, a mirror held up to the nation. The chamber, the cameras, the hashtags, those were just the stage. The heart of the story was timeless. Service versus ego, truth versus bluster, dignity versus arrogance. In a political era addicted to noise, Crockett's calm, steady cadence rang louder than any insult could. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to sneer. She let her family's sacrifice speak for itself. And in doing so, she silenced not just one senator, but the very culture of empty bravado that too often drowns out substance. And in that silence, millions of Americans heard something rare: clarity. They heard that respect is not negotiable, that dignity is not weakness, that truth, when spoken with conviction, has a power no headline, no meme, no opponent can diminish. For days, the clip played like a chorus, echoing in classrooms, living rooms, church basements, and VFW halls. Each time it played, it reminded people of the same lesson: patriotism is not shouted, it is not posed, it is not claimed through arrogance. Patriotism is lived in the sacrifices made by families like Crockett's, in the quiet dignity of those who serve, in the unshakable resolve to honor them. And so, when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward that day and gave her answer, she did more than defend herself. She defended the very soul of what it means to be American. In a single answer, she proved that patriotism isn't shouted, it's lived. Senator Tuberville thought he could question Jasmine Crockett's knowledge. He thought his tone, his posture, his reputation would corner her. But what silenced him was not a rehearsed line or a clever retort. It was her family's record, etched in years of service, sacrifice, and loyalty to a country that did not always return the favor. In that moment, arrogance collapsed under the weight of truth. The lesson was undeniable. When ego tries to masquerade as authority, when arrogance confuses volume for power, there will always be voices like Crockett's to cut through the noise. Because dignity, grounded in lived experience, will always outlast bluster. And truth, spoken with conviction, has a way of silencing even the loudest stage. That is why this moment matters. It wasn't just about one senator, one congresswoman, or one chamber exchange. It was about America seeing in real time the difference between performative patriotism and authentic service. It was about remembering that our strength as a nation is not found in insults or posturing, but in the sacrifices of families who carry our ideals forward with quiet courage. So if you believe that dignity beats ego, that respect outweighs arrogance, and that truth deserves to be amplified, then don't let this story stop here. Share it, subscribe to this channel. Stand with us for the next showdown, because moments like this aren't just history, they're fuel for the future. Jasmine Crockett proved that patriotism isn't shouted, it's lived. And with your voice added to hers, the silence that followed Tuberville's question can echo into something far louder, a movement built on respect, truth, and the unshakable belief that dignity will always prevail.